Zelda Fitzgerald is one of the most enigmatic personalities of the jazz age. Opinions about her tend to be polarised, some seeing her flamboyant, high-spending lifestyle as a constant drain on the creative energy of her husband, F. Scott Fitzgerald, one of America's greatest writers. Others regard her as a talented writer and artist in her own right who was driven to madness by Scott's out-of-control drinking. The most ardent Zelda fans argue she was a victim of a jealous and over-controlling husband who had her locked away while he stole her writing and claimed it as his own.
Welcome to Insane History. I'm Professor Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the dazzling but ultimately tragic life of Zelda Fitzgerald. I'll be trying to unpick some of the long-accepted myths about her to find out how the life of the vivacious Southern belle slowly unravelled and how she dealt with her illness and forged a new creative identity.
Zelda Sayre was born in Montgomery, Alabama in July 1900. Her father, Anthony Sayre, was a lawyer and politician who ended up as a judge in the Supreme Court of Alabama. He was from a well-established and deeply conservative Southern family. He was a strict, unemotional man who lived by routine, going to and from work at exactly the same time every day and always retiring to bed on the stroke of 8:30. Her mother, Minnie, from an equally established Confederate family, was more musical and arty and had aspirations of going onto the stage before her father married her off. Minnie had 6 children, but her first son died of meningitis at the age of 18 months, after which she had a prolonged period of depression, one of many throughout her life. There was mental illness on both sides of the family. Minnie's mother and sister both took their own lives, and Judge Sayre also had bouts of depression, one of which left him unable to function for 9 months. Growing up in affluence, Zelda was indulged by her mother and had plenty of domestic servants to fetch and carry for her. She was bright, but not interested in schoolwork, preferring ballet and outdoor sports. She liked to shock by flirting, drinking gin and smoking, and she loved being the centre of attention. Her unconventional behaviour, good looks and carefree attitude made her both popular and the subject of gossip. On graduating high school, she was voted prettiest and most attractive in her class. One of her childhood friends later recalled that she was mischievous and funny, the most popular girl at school, envied and adored by all, and besieged by boys. She had a racy reputation and often teased her dates by ignoring them and making eyes at others. And when the US War Department set up Camp Sheridan just outside Montgomery to house 30,000 men, the young officers gave Zelda a lot of attention on their visits to town. In July 1918, at a country club dance, she met the handsome 22-year-old Lieutenant F. Scott Fitzgerald. He was disillusioned with life, having been rejected by his first love, Ginevra King, to the extent that he had abandoned Princeton without graduating and signed up to fight in the First World War. What made him different to all the other young men lining up to dance with Zelda is that he had written a novel, a rather risque one at that, The Romantic Egoist.
One can imagine how exciting this must have seemed to a young girl desperate to break out of the constricting, small-town conventionality of Montgomery and see the world.
Zelda herself liked to write and had won a prize at school for her story The Iceberg, about a plucky young woman from an aristocratic but poor Southern family who escapes the uninspiring future that is her lot by going out and creating her own destiny. Fitzgerald phoned every day and visited her on his days off. They went for long walks in Oakwood Cemetery, and he talked about his novel and how he was going to be a great writer. They talked and walked and walked and talked, and he let her read his novel. It had been rejected by a publisher, but not completely. He had been encouraged to revise it and resubmit it. How he was going to do this filled their autumn perambulations, and they started to like each other. Their literary discussions, however, were interrupted by the 9th Infantry's transfer to Camp Mills, Long Island in October to await a troopship to France, and a good chance of many of them not returning. Fortunately for their romance, the armistice on the 11th of November put an end to the war, and Fitzgerald was sent back to Montgomery, where he picked up his courtship of Zelda, and they began what Scott later described as a recklessly passionate relationship. When Fitzgerald was decommissioned in February 1919, he headed north to New York to conquer the literary world. But all that passion before he left led to a pregnancy scare. Zelda wrote to him panicking, and he sent her some pills to fix the problem, but she refused to take them. Fortunately, it was a false alarm, and they continued writing tender and loving letters to each other, and Scott sent her a ring to confirm their unofficial engagement. Unofficial, as Zelda was not yet convinced of his prospects, and made it clear that she would not marry him until he was financially secure, and she did not curtail her busy social life while he was away. In New York, Fitzgerald also enjoyed their time apart, having a brief but intense affair with English actress Rosalind Fuller. Unimpressed by his lack of success, Zelda broke off their engagement, and Fitzgerald quit his advertising job and returned to his parents in St. Paul, Minnesota, to lock himself away and finish his novel. His central character, a cruel and narcissistic flapper, is very much based on Zelda, and he also used parts of a letter she sent him about their walks in the cemetery. "I've spent today in the graveyard. Isn't it funny how, out of a row of Confederate soldiers, 2 or 3 will make you think of dead lovers and dead loves, when they're exactly like the others, even to the yellowish moss." In September 1919, Scott's retitled novel was finally accepted for publication, and they were engaged again. While waiting for the official launch, his short stories started selling, the money began to roll in, and the wedding date was set. This Side of Paradise hit the shelves in March 1920, and a few days later they were married in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral. It was a small, hurried ceremony arranged by Scott, and attended only by Zelda's 3 sisters, their husbands, and 3 of Scott's friends. There were no parents, no flowers, there was no music, no photographer, and no reception. Zelda never made her feelings known about Scott's perfunctory and uncaring wedding preparations, but it was surely not what a Southern belle would have expected. Her new husband's book was an instant success, selling out its initial print run in less than a week and making them a household name. With fame came money. The newlyweds lived in luxury at one of New York's most glamorous hotels. The newspapers were full of their crazy antics, making them one of the first celebrity couples. But the tone was often reproachful, cautioning others against their drunken excesses. The endless gin cocktails led to shameless flirting by Zelda with Scott's friends. She suggested crawling into bed with one, although only to sleep. Asked screenwriter Townsend Martin if he would give her a bath, and kissed men passionately on the lips immediately after meeting them. Writer Edmund Wilson, another college friend of Scott, was fascinated by her, writing that she talked with so spontaneous a colour and wit, "I have rarely known a woman who expressed herself so delightfully and freshly." At first, Scott encouraged her wildness. It was fun, and gave him endless material for his short stories. But he grew weary at the strain of providing Zelda with a constant stream of expensive gifts and opportunities to act disgracefully. Writing to a friend, however, he said, "I fell in love with her courage, her sincerity, and her flaming self-respect. And it's these things I'd believe in, even if the whole world indulged in wild suspicions that she wasn't all she should be. I love her, and that's the beginning and end of everything." But their relationship was complicated and unconventional, and within a few weeks of saying his wedding vows, Scott was already having an affair. And with Zelda's best friend's sister, so she was always going to find out. Perhaps hoping to escape the temptations of the city, they moved out of New York and rented a house 50 miles away in Westport, Connecticut, so Scott could work on his second novel and Zelda could swim. She had always been an outdoor, sporty girl, so having a house with its own beach enabled her to burn off some of her energy. She even tried to be a polite and well-behaved housewife for a while, and invited her neighbours for tea, but this didn't last long. As she had always had servants, she had no idea how to cook or clean, and happily conceded that she was completely useless as a housekeeper. When asked to contribute a piece for a collection of favourite recipes of famous women, Zelda gave her version of breakfast. See if there is any bacon, and if there is, ask the cook which pan to fry it in. Then ask if there are any eggs, and if so, try and persuade the cook to poach 2 of them. It is better not to attempt toast, as it burns very easily. Also, in the case of bacon, do not turn the fire too high, or you will have to get out of the house for a week. Zelda was soon unendurably bored of sitting around while Scott wrote, and, homesick for southern cooking, she suggested a little 1,200-mile jaunt to see her parents in Montgomery. In their Marmon roadster, which they christened the Rolling Junk, they motored for 8 days solid, on a trip that was filled with incident: a broken axle, flat tyres, speeding fines, running out of money, and being ejected from a hotel in Virginia because of their oh-so-natty matching travelling suits. As they approached Montgomery, Zelda suddenly started crying, because things were the same, and yet not the same. And her sadness wasn't lifted by finding out that her parents were out of town, as they hadn't cabled them to say they were coming. Back in Westport, Zelda's parents came to visit. Her father was not impressed at their constant partying, drinking, and scandalous lifestyle. Responding to his disapproval, Zelda tried to prise a gin bottle from Scott's hands at breakfast one morning, but he fended her off into the swing door, giving her a nosebleed and black eye. Not wanting to spend a winter in the country, they relocated to an apartment in Manhattan, ordering meals from the Plaza Hotel around the corner and snacking on olive sandwiches washed down with whiskey. When Lawton Campbell, an old school friend of Zelda's, visited, he described their apartment as bedlam. Dishes all over the place, the bed unmade, books and papers scattered everywhere, ashtrays overflowing with cigarette butts and liquor glasses from the night before. He described how Scott would be dressing, while Zelda, luxuriating in the bathtub, would carry on a steady flow of conversation with the door half open. Scott found it difficult to write if Zelda was in their apartment, because she wanted his attention, and unable to write if she was not there, because of worrying what she might be getting up to, and with whom. They both confided to friends that their marriage couldn't last much longer if they continued living life at this pace. But in early 1921, Zelda found out she was expecting, and she went to visit her parents. Still seeing herself more as a belle than a housefrau, she agreed to dance in the annual masked ball, a Hawaiian pageant at which she wiggled her derriere more suggestively than anyone else, announcing to everyone she was back. But it wasn't for long, as the Fitzgeralds sailed for Europe on the luxurious Aquitania, recently refitted after its service as a troop ship in the First World War. First, they visited London, where Zelda dined with Winston Churchill, did a Jack the Ripper tour of Whitechapel, and fell asleep at a cricket match. Then it was off to France, which Scott felt was a bore and a disappointment, and Italy, which he described as merely of antiquarian interest. Then back to the US and her parents' house, where Zelda wanted to have the baby. But a late summer heatwave made Scott insist on them going north. Zelda wasn't happy, but agreed, and their daughter Scotty was born in his hometown of St. Paul, Minnesota. Zelda had a long, difficult labour, and her first words about her baby as she emerged from the anaesthetic were, "I hope it's beautiful and a fool, a beautiful little fool." And as with so many of her words, they would eventually appear in one of Scott's stories, these famously in The Great Gatsby. Parenthood didn't slow them down. They hired nurses and nannies and continued the same punishing round of parties as before. Scott's second novel, The Beautiful and Damned, appeared in March 1922. The critics were positive and it sold well, confirming his position as one of the finest and most bankable writers of his generation. The novel is very much based on his and Zelda's lifestyle at this time, and incorporated some of Zelda's diary entries and letters. a newspaper invited Zelda to write a satirical review, and although she had proofread and been very much involved in the drafting and finalising of the novel, she pretended to be reading it for the first time. On one page I recognised a portion of an old diary of mine, and also scraps of letters which, though considerably edited, sound to me vaguely familiar. In fact, Mr. Fitzgerald, I believe that is how he spells his name, seems to believe that plagiarism begins at home. Rather than complaining, however, she goes on to say that she hoped her husband's novel would become a commercial success, as there is the cutest cloth of gold dress for only $300 in a store on 42nd Street. The article led to publishers commissioning other pieces and stories from her, and in June 1922 Metropolitan magazine published an essay entitled Eulogy on the Flapper. It is a witty and perceptive piece, poking fun at those who were attempting to place the blame for all of society's woes on the shoulders of the modern liberated woman, the flapper.
How much of Zelda's work was her own, and how much of Scott's was his, continues to be a topic of fierce debate among literary scholars, and I'm not sure there'll ever be a clear answer.
But according to their daughter Scotty, her father spent many hours editing Zelda's short stories, and Zelda also contributed to his, through editorial advice and the phrases she came out with, which Scott would scribble down on scraps of paper and the backs of envelopes to use later. With Scotty just a year old, they moved to Great Neck on Long Island, the model for West Egg in The Great Gatsby. Supported by a nurse, a live-in servant couple, and a laundress, they partied like there was no tomorrow in the mansions of the super-rich that surrounded them. Although Scott was earning a lot of money, they were spending it faster than it was coming in, a tragedy which he wryly documented in How to Live on $36,000 a Year. And their financial woes were compounded by Scott's next venture, a play based on The Vegetable, one of his short stories, which was a complete disaster. Zelda had suggested a plot twist for Act 2, but at its trial run in Atlantic City, the play's weaknesses became apparent when half the audience walked out. The show flopped as flat as one of Aunt Jemima's famous pancakes, she wrote. And this pancake plunged Scott into a slump of depression and debt, forcing him to churn out pot boilers for magazines to earn some cash. A task he regarded as worthless in literary terms, but a task he always returned to when the coffers were bare. In April 1924, hoping to get away from the endless round of parties, drinking and bitter arguments, and with the intention of living a little more within their means, they set sail for Europe again. In their short stay in Paris, 2-year-old Scotty managed to gulp down a gin fizz thinking it was lemonade, then promptly threw up, and demonstrating the full depth of their parenting skills, they bathed her in a bidet, not knowing what it was. Then it was off to the French Riviera, which in that post-war period had become popular with wealthy Americans. Scott worked on The Great Gatsby, but Zelda got bored and became involved with a French aviator, Edouard Jossin. Scott didn't notice at first, but after a few weeks, when Zelda asked for a divorce, he locked her away in their villa and stormed off to challenge Jossin to a duel.
At least this is one account, but we don't really know what happened, as both Scott and Zelda gave different versions of the affair to different people, and Jossin dismissed the entire thing as a fabrication.
But it was real enough for Zelda to take an overdose of sleeping pills when it ended, and it was real enough to mark a change in their marriage. Scott wrote in his notebook, "I knew something had happened that could never be repaired." As despite all of her previous flirting and his affairs, for the first time Scott felt he could no longer be certain of Zelda's love for him. Zelda was different too. Friends noticed that she took unnecessary risks, diving off 35-foot-high rocks into the sea and driving recklessly after drinking. When the dust had settled a little, they headed to Rome, where Scott finally finished off the Gatsby manuscript, and Zelda did the sights. She was still suffering from a lot of abdominal pain from an operation the year before, and Scott, as always, was drinking heavily. so much so that he ended up in the cells after a brawl with some taxi drivers, and Zelda had to call on the embassy to get him out. They retreated to the island of Capri, where Zelda began to paint seriously, having lessons and discussing all the latest trends in modern art. Scott drank as he anxiously awaited the publication of The Great Gatsby, turning down a $10,000 offer to serialise it, as he wanted it on the shelves as soon as possible. Despite having 4-day-long rows with Zelda, Scott wrote, "We're still enormously in love, and about the only truly happy couple I know. The cheerfulest things in my life are first, Zelda, and second, the hope that my book has something extraordinary about it." But when it appeared in April, despite receiving mostly favourable reviews, it didn't sell nearly as well as his previous books. Back in France, they alternated between Paris and the Riviera, and befriended a group of literary expatriates, including James Joyce, whose groundbreaking but scandalous novel Ulysses had just been published. Their new friends were fascinated by Zelda's charm and wit, but discomforted by her and Scott's drinking and very public squabbling. Zelda confided to friends that the squabbling sometimes ended in violence when the doors were closed, and she had packed her trunk and been ready to leave on many occasions. The younger Hemingway got on well with Fitzgerald, but really didn't like Zelda, describing her as insane. He felt Zelda took Scott away from writing novels to churn out cheery, optimistic tales to fund their extravagant lifestyle, even encouraging him to rework his stories to increase their commercial appeal. Hemingway paints a very negative picture of Zelda in his memoirs, and the dislike was mutual. Zelda thought Hemingway was a pain in the neck and as phony as a rubber check. Zelda also experimented with the variety of experiences available in Paris, finding Scott a little unadventurous. Enjoying themselves and drinking way too much alcohol was the focus of their lives, but this often led to jealousy and destructive quarrels. Zelda had a summer of gynecological problems and frustration at not being able to conceive, but still liked to be the centre of attention. There are tales of her dancing on tables at casinos and finishing off dinner parties with a rather spicy striptease. One evening, at a restaurant, she took offence to Scott showing too much attention to the ageing dancer Isadora Duncan, and to everyone's horror, she allowed herself to fall down the long stone staircase on the edge of the terrace, cutting and bruising herself, but saying not a word. It just couldn't go on, and when Fitzgerald was invited to write the screenplay for a Hollywood comedy, they abandoned Europe and headed to California. But nothing really changed. The parties continued, just with a new crowd of people. Scotty was left with a nanny at Scott's parents', and although Zelda wrote to say she loved getting her letters, that it was more fun to read them than eating or diving or having a new dress. They continued drinking too much and staging silly pranks. Putting her bra on one of the garden statues at a Hearst mansion party, boiling up the watches and jewellery of guests in a pan of tomato soup at another, and gate-crashing a soirée at Samuel Goldwyn's house only to go upstairs to take a bath. Zelda complained of being bored, while Scott found companionship elsewhere. 17-year-old Lois Moran, a pretty young starlet who he visited regularly, to talk about books apparently, and only when her mother was around. Whether their relationship was innocent or not, Lois made enough of an impression for him to write her into a short story and change one of the characters in his next novel. Zelda had always been the inspiration for his characters, so when some young flibberty-gibbet threatened to take her place, she was not amused. In a blazing row, Scott said he respected Lois because at least she was doing something with herself, which required effort as well as talent. Zelda's reaction was to set fire to her clothes in a bathtub. After 2 miserable months, their Hollywood interlude was over, and they headed back east. For the next 2 years, they rented a grand 30-room mansion near Wilmington, Delaware, to allow Scott to work on Tender is the Night. To fill her time, and possibly as a reaction to his taunts about doing something which required effort, Zelda revived her childhood passion for dance and began seriously practicing ballet, creating her own dance studio in the half-empty house. She also wrote several short stories, including Millionaire's Girl, her response to the Lois Moran affair. College Humour bought 2 of her pieces and considered Zelda a talent in her own right, but 5 out of the 6 stories she wrote in this period were published with both her and Scott's names in the byline, even though Scott's input was minimal. Even worse was the fact that Scott's agent submitted Millionaire's Girl to the Saturday Evening Post in Scott's name, thinking it was his work, but when it was accepted and discovered that it was entirely written by Zelda, the magazine offered $4,000, but only if Zelda's name was omitted.
It is this hijacking of her work that has led Zelda fans to vilify Scott, accusing him of stealing her work because of his own insecurities and need to keep her in her place.
The usual justification given in his defence is that it was economic necessity. With joint credits, her stories commanded a higher fee of around $500 per article.
Where the truth lies, we'll probably never know. Somewhere in the middle, perhaps? But the original manuscript versions of all 6 short stories show that Zelda has scored out Scott's name from the byline to write me.
In spring 1929, they returned to Europe, where Zelda's behaviour changed. In her drive to improve her ballet, she practised day and night. Her friends noticed something was different. She was not her normal vivacious self. She burst into laughter or tears for no reason. Her poise and wit were gone. She went off at tangents when talking, and it was difficult to follow her thought processes. She was starving herself to stay thin and practising furiously to the point of exhaustion, and attending classes with Lyubov Yegorova, star of the Mariinsky Theatre in St. Petersburg and Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. She was so fanatical about not being late that one day she changed into her ballet clothes in the back of a taxi, and when it got stuck in traffic, she jumped out and ran to the class. After another session, she threw herself at Yegorova's feet and declared her undying devotion. In September 1929, she had an offer from the San Carlo Opera House in Naples, one of the oldest and most prestigious theatres in Italy, for a significant solo role in Aida and other solo roles throughout the season. It was what she had been working so hard for. It was a vindication of all the effort she had made. She would be independent, a person in her own right. She was incredibly excited and talked about it with everyone. And then she turned it down.
It's hard to understand this decision. Was it pressure from Scott? The thought of not seeing Scotty? Was it fear of failure? Or was she so intertwined and enmeshed with her husband that the prospect of being apart was just too much?
A month later, while driving back to Paris along the mountainous roads of the Grande Corniche with 9-year-old Scotty in the back, Zelda suddenly grabbed the steering wheel and tried to force the car over a cliff. Scott managed to stop inches from the drop, but Zelda just couldn't really explain why she did it. She started hearing voices and was convinced people were talking about her. She stopped eating. When she wasn't dancing, she painted. In one of her pictures from this period, White Flowers in a Vase, Zelda saw parallels with Van Gogh's flower paintings. The crawling flowers and venomous vindictive blossoms are the hallucinations of a madman, without organisation or rhythm, but with the power to sting and strangle.
Now, I'm no art critic, so I don't know if this makes any sense or not in art terms, but as a psychiatrist, I'd be worried if one of my patients came out with something like this.
Zelda was ill from bronchitis and her gruelling ballet regime, which she continued despite turning down the job in Naples. So Scott suggested a short holiday in Algeria, then a playground for well-heeled French tourists. Zelda couldn't relax. She resented being taken away from her practice and disliked everyone she met, describing the bar at the hotel as an outpost of civilization with people accentuating their eccentricities. In April 1930, everything came to a head when she collapsed, exhausted, and was admitted to the Malmaison Sanatorium a few miles outside Paris. On arrival, she was in a highly agitated state, pacing the room, unable to sit still. "It's appalling. It's horrific," she said. "What's going to become of me? I have to work. I can't anymore. I have to die, and yet I must work. I shall never be cured. Let me go. I must go and see Madame. She gave me the greatest joy that can ever be."
Tearful one minute, determined to leave the next, she flirted with the doctors and repeatedly declared her love for Madame Yegorova.
Leading French psychiatrist Professeur Henri Claude diagnosed anxiety with obsessional ideas and lesbian tendencies. He advised complete rest, but Zelda discharged herself after 9 days. Back in their apartment, Zelda immediately resumed her ballet practice. But she was not well. Her eczema flared up and she experienced hallucinations of horrific phantoms in the daytime and waking her from sleep. Scott was scared. He felt he could not leave her side, but this simply increased her feelings of being trapped, and she took an overdose. After this, Scott drove her to the Valmont Sanatorium near Montreux in Switzerland. She told her doctor she was not ill and had been taken forcibly to the clinic, and he noted her husband's visits often ended in heated quarrels.
She would work herself into a very excited state at the thought that she was losing precious time and that people were trying to take away the things that were most dear to her, her dancing and her love for Yegorova.
She continued to display sexually disinhibited behaviour, and the nurses reported having to fend off her over-affectionate behaviour. Sadly, when asked what role 8-year-old Scotty played in her life, she responded, "That is done now. I want to do something else." She was treated with barbiturates every 2 hours to calm her down, and when quieter, she would accept that she was unwell and needed to be taken care of. But an hour later, she would insist on returning to Paris. The Valmont clinic, which was primarily for gastrointestinal problems, felt she had taken flight into homosexuality in order to distance herself from her husband, and needed specialist psychiatric treatment. So, after 2 weeks, she was transferred to a mental hospital on the shores of Lake Geneva. Recently opened, Prangin had quickly gained the reputation of being one of the best psychiatric hospitals in Europe, and was eye-wateringly expensive at $1,000 per month. Only a small number of private patients was admitted, housed in spacious villas set in 100 acres of gardens with facilities for swimming, tennis and other sports. For several weeks, Zelda refused to take part in any of the activities provided and avoided the other patients. She then developed an intense emotional attachment to another female patient, as well as several nurses. As she started to talk more, she said that there had been nothing wrong with her, but in the previous hospital her head began to go wrong, because one of the nurses there would not leave her alone. Her doctor, Oscar Forel, diagnosed her with schizophrenia, but also asked Eugen Bleuler, head of the psychiatry department at the University of Zurich, to assess her. Bleuler invented the word schizophrenia in 1911, but the meaning of the term has changed over time, and in the 1920s it encompassed cases that we would perhaps not think of as having schizophrenia today. And Forel later changed his views, writing, "She is neither suffering from a pure neurosis nor a real psychosis. I consider her a constitutional, emotionally unbalanced psychopath." Scott was not allowed to visit, but he remained in Switzerland for more than a year while Scotty was left in Paris with the governess, apart from occasional visits to the mountains. In Zelda's first heartrending letter from the hospital, she begged Scott to come and see her, saying that she felt thoroughly humiliated and broken.
And never one to waste good material, Scott reproduced parts of this very personal letter, almost word for word, in Tender is the Night.
They exchanged almost 100 letters over the next year, blaming, apologising, trying to make sense of what was happening.
At times they were filled with bitter recriminations, at other times with tender appeals for forgiveness. And Scott tried to understand his wife's illness by reading about psychiatry and psychoanalysis.
And slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, Zelda began to improve. Her initial letters of anger and resentment gradually gave way to more conciliatory and affectionate letters. I wonder why we have never been very happy, and why all this has happened. It was much nicer a long time ago when we had each other, and the space around the world was warm. Can't we get it back some way, even by imagining? At one point Zelda suggested Scott should free himself by divorcing her, but he declared, "I love you with all my heart because you are my own girl, and that is all I know." After 15 months in hospital, she was discharged from Prongan, and they immediately returned to America and settled in Montgomery to be close to Zelda's parents, where they swam, played tennis and golf. Scott wrote and Zelda painted, and also wrote. Under the watchful gaze of his parents-in-law, Scott had to moderate his drinking, which made him tense and irritable. So he was not unhappy when he was offered a Hollywood scriptwriting job, which took him to California for 2 months. On receiving a recording from him, Zelda wrote, "That is the sweetest, loveliest voice I have ever heard. It made me feel safe in the centre of things again." In November, her father died and was buried in Oakwood Cemetery, where Zelda and Scott had once taken romantic walks. Scott returned to Montgomery to work on his novel, and they seemed happy for a while as Zelda made paper dolls for Scotty and they talked about trying for another child. But Zelda's sleep pattern started to become more erratic, so hoping for some sea air they travelled to Florida. However, when Zelda announced she was writing her own novel about her mental breakdown, covering exactly the same ground as Scott's own work in progress, he was incandescent. The arguing led to Zelda drinking, which led to her hearing voices and becoming terrified that people were doing things to her. She recognised she was becoming unwell again and asked to be hospitalised. They contacted Dr. Farrell, who recommended Adolph Meyer, one of the leading figures of American psychiatry at the Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So began her second admission, only 5 months after leaving Prongan. Meyer was an expert in schizophrenia, but considered Zelda's case unusual, a folie à deux, or joint psychosis. He believed the Fitzgeralds had a complex interaction of unconscious denial, cross-identification and escapism into alcohol, and that they were interdependent, enmeshed and entwined. He suggested that Scott would need to accept treatment for his drink problem if Zelda was ever to improve, but Scott refused, convinced that alcohol was essential for his writing and psychotherapy would smother his creativity. Fortunately, Zelda's mental state improved anyway, and after 2 months she was allowed to go out every morning, and they rented a large house close to the hospital, where for the next year they tried to lead a semblance of normal family life, with Scotty attending school locally. Zelda would often accompany Scott for lunch with their friends and do her best to seem like her old self. Critic H.L. Mencken described one of these in his diary. She managed to get through lunch quietly enough, but there was a wild look in her eye, and now and then she showed plain signs of her mental distress. As part of her rehabilitation, she was encouraged to write for 2 hours a day, and she used her time well to finish the manuscript of her novel, which she sent off to Scott's editor, Maxwell Perkins. Scott wasn't happy at what he regarded as her plagiarism of his material, but he eventually calmed down and realised it was an opportunity to pay off some of their debts. It was long thought that he had made major revisions to make it ready for press, but analysis of the original manuscript and edits show his input was minimal, and the book was all Zelda's own work. After a further 2 months, she was discharged. Scott continued working on Tender is the Night, but progress was slow, partly because of having to do hack work to pay the bills, but mainly because of his drinking. In the mornings, Zelda would often dance in her tutu, but for her own pleasure now, and not with the same fanaticism as in Paris. Her novel, Save Me the Waltz, appeared in October 1932. William McFee of the New York Sun told readers, "There is the promise of a new and vigorous personality in fiction," but also criticised its crudity of conception, its ruthless purloinings of technical tricks, and its pathetic striving after philosophic profundity.
And this was one of the more positive reviews. It sold only 1,400 copies and made Zelda a paltry $120.73, even less than her short stories.
Her disappointment was not helped by her loving husband telling her she was a third-rate writer and a third-rate ballet dancer. After a monumental argument in which Scott banned her from writing any more stories or novels, she stormed off and burnt her clothes to make a point. The fire got out of control, however, and damaged several rooms, valuable books, manuscripts, and many of Zelda's paintings. With fiction out of bounds, Zelda switched to drama, writing a play, Scandalabra, which had a local production by Baltimore's Vagabond Junior Players with sets painted by Zelda.
But it was way too long, and it needed drastic last-minute editing to make it performable, and it wasn't a success.
Zelda was then left with painting. She contributed to an exhibition and sold some of her pictures, but gave away many more to family and friends. Also around this time, her brother took his own life by jumping from a hospital window in Mobile, Alabama, where he was being treated for severe depression. Scott tried to keep her spirits up with a trip to Bermuda, but it was all too much, and in February 1934, Zelda's illness relapsed, and she was readmitted to the Phipps Clinic in Baltimore. Although she improved quite quickly this time, Scott was worried that her coming home might disrupt his work on checking the galley proofs for his novel. So she went instead to the luxurious and very expensive Craig House Clinic in upstate New York. Run by Dr. Clarence Slocum, it was more like a country club than a hospital, and she played golf and bridge, swam in the pool, painted and worked on magazine pieces. Scotty was even allowed to come and stay at weekends. While at the hospital, she had a month-long exhibition of 32 of her paintings and drawings at Carey Ross's gallery in New York, which she was given leave to attend. Time magazine said, "The show is the work of a brilliant introvert, vividly painted and intensely rhythmic." But other reviews were less favourable. At times people were queuing up to get in, at other times the gallery was completely empty. But she managed to sell most of her pictures, although the asking prices were strangely low, $200 for her watercolours and only $15 to $30 for her drawings. Back at Craig House, she is then said to have become catatonic, a term used to describe people with severe schizophrenia whose movements and speech are slowed up so much that they can seem more dead than alive. Scott uses the word in a letter to Mencken, but there is no other evidence to suggest that she was this unwell. In fact, she was just feeling frustrated at being in a place costing $750 a month when she knew money was tight, and asking to move somewhere cheaper. Not catatonic at all. Tender is the Night came out in April, but unlike Scott's earlier work, it received mixed reviews and a decidedly lukewarm response from the buying public. The world had moved on and was less interested in the troubles of the idle rich. In May, Zelda was transferred to the Shepherd Pratt Hospital in Towson on the outskirts of Baltimore, not for clinical reasons, but because it was cheaper. It was a very different institution from her previous hospitals. On admission, she was roughly searched, had her possessions confiscated, and was doused in disinfectant. She was sedated with morphine, chloral hydrate, and sodium amytal, and during periods of excitation she was treated with stramonium from the Devil's Trumpet plant and not allowed to write. The medical director was keen on trying all the new treatments as they became available, including metrazole convulsive therapy, a forerunner of electroshock therapy, which had first been used in Hungary by Ladislas Meduna only a few months previously. In this treatment, convulsions are produced by injecting a powerful stimulant. It was one of the earliest effective treatments for severe depression, but it was not pleasant, as it caused an overwhelming sense of impending death just before the seizure onset, and post-treatment agitation which lasted for several hours. It wasn't all bad though, and there were activities, and somehow Zelda kept a sense of humour, writing to Scott that the Shepherd Pratt Hospital is located somewhere in the hinterlands of the human consciousness, and I can be located there any time between the dawn of consciousness and the beginning of old age. Darling, life is difficult.
Although Scott was not allowed to visit, she had hallucinations of his voice. It was a hard time. She felt guilty at being ill and tried to strangle herself several times.
Scott and Scotty were living in a townhouse, and though he tried to work on his next project, the years of heavy drinking were beginning to affect his health. He wasn't as sharp and was finding it hard to hold the complex structures of a novel in his mind. He recognised this himself and signed himself into Johns Hopkins on 8 separate occasions to try to dry out. He begged to be allowed to visit Zelda, but when he was finally permitted to see her and take her for a walk in the grounds, she broke away and rushed to the nearby railway track, and Scott only just managed to pull her away seconds before a train passed. Zelda was not allowed to write, and her only consolation was the Bible, which she read for 2 hours each day. During better periods, she was allowed home at weekends, and when the ban on her writing was lifted, her mood improved, and she planned a book of short stories and essays, and even got as far as designing the dust jacket. But her mood plummeted again, and she was inaccessible, uncooperative, and violent. For most of 1935, she was unable to do anything, or take in any news. She barely spoke, and her weight dropped to only 89 pounds or 40 kilograms. She believed she was in direct communication with Christ, Apollo, and William the Conqueror, and was convinced the end of the world was approaching. Worried that she would fade away if she was left where she was, Scott arranged for her to be transferred to Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina, under the care of Dr. Robert Carroll, author of several books illustrating his supposedly humanistic approach to psychiatry. His treatments, however, included injecting patients with placental blood and honey, and even injecting horse serum into patients' cerebrospinal fluid by lumbar puncture. She also received anywhere between 30 and 90 insulin chemotherapy treatments, and later electroconvulsive therapy. Dr. Carroll also ordered strict diets and a regimented exercise routine of outdoor gymnastics and a 5-mile walk every afternoon. In her occupational therapy sessions, she was allowed to paint, and she was given the standard re-education talks to help her return to being a good wife and mother. Scott also paid extra for her to have dance lessons, and Zelda would choreograph short ballets for hospital events. Scott's income had almost completely dried up, so to save money he closed up their Baltimore house and moved to Asheville, and Zelda was occasionally allowed out to meet him for lunch in the town. The hospital was set in 80 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and Zelda painted landscapes and played tennis and swam. She was allowed to walk into Asheville alone, and even to travel to visit her mother. This lifted her spirits, and she was almost like her old self again, talking about music, the theatre, and art. One of her doctors said she was not incoherent, she was absolutely lucid. When she talked, you certainly listened. She was an interesting, intelligent, compelling woman to talk to. She had a very good mind that wasn't being stretched. In 1937, Scott was offered another chance as a screenwriter at MGM. Even though he'd have to move to Los Angeles and be away from Zelda, he was in no position to refuse the huge salary, and for the next 2 years he lived modestly and tried to stay off the booze. Despite earning the most he ever had, it all went on paying off debts, Zelda's medical bills, and Scotty's school fees. He began a relationship with the English-born gossip columnist Sheila Graeme, but continued writing tender letters to Zelda in hospital. Zelda saw him for the last time on a disastrous trip to Cuba, where his out-of-control drinking led to him getting beaten up, and Zelda had to arrange for them to get back to New York and for Scott to be admitted to hospital for yet another detox, while she quietly made her way back to Asheville.
By late 1939, she was regularly going into Asheville by herself and taking gym classes at the hospital. And there was also a big scandal when one of the doctors was accused of taking advantage of several of the female patients, including Zelda.
In April 1940 she was discharged at last, but there was no one to embrace her at the gate, no one to put her bags in the car and drive her off to celebrate her freedom. Scott had sent a rather feeble, apologetic letter, and she caught a bus back to Montgomery. She lived with her mother in a small house, tended the garden, painted, took long walks, and had dance lessons, but had to make do with an allowance of only $30 a week that Scott provided. It was a far cry from the extravagance of her New York days, but so much better than what she had been through, and Zelda herself never once complained. She exhibited her artwork locally and made a serious attempt on a second novel. She went to the church every day and sat in peace, and would ride on streetcars to the end of the line and back. She exchanged loving letters with Scott in Los Angeles, with no mention of Sheila Graeme, and there was vague talk about him coming over to visit. In December, it was too late. After 2 warning angina attacks, Scott died of a heart attack at the age of 44. When she was told, Zelda collapsed in grief. But she made all the arrangements for his funeral in Maryland, to be close to his parents. The Catholic cemetery, however, denied him entry as he was non-practicing in his final years, so he was buried in the Protestant Rockville Cemetery. Only 30 people attended. Zelda was not among them, although she sent a basket of pink gladioli. Despite the huge amounts he earned at his peak, Scott's estate left Zelda with an annuity of just $50 per month.
Most Fitzgerald biographers portray the final years of Zelda's life as the sad, diminished existence of someone robbed of her personhood by mental illness, barely coping with the outside world between her admissions to hospital. But this is wrong. Although she was considered a bit of an eccentric in Montgomery, as she cycled around town in her homemade clothes, she carried on with her painting, and when the few friends who continued to visit came, she would talk fondly about Scott and their life together.
One of her greatest fears was that he would be forgotten. She painted the places where they had been happy together, Paris, New York, and later she moved on to painting large biblical canvases.
For some, this newfound interest in religion was a sign of her mental frailty. But why? Why couldn't it have been a genuine embracing of a new way of being? Very different from the hedonism of her youth, certainly, but not necessarily illness-related.
In 1944, she went back into the hospital in Asheville for 8 weeks, not 6 months as was previously thought. 2 years later, she had another spell in Highland Hospital. This time it was for 12 weeks, and not the 8 months that many biographers still quote. Zelda found it difficult living with her mother, so she moved to Asheville, where she sketched, played tennis, and lived a simple life. She visited Scotty in New York, who was married, and she saw her first grandson. As Scotty was beginning her life, her mother wrote, "I wish that I had been able to do better at one thing, and not been so given to running into cul-de-sacs with so many." In November 1947, Zelda returned to Highland Hospital. She had become depressed again, and her weight dropped to 110 pounds. She had the same old treatments of insulin coma and electroshock therapy, but improved enough to be able to respond positively to the news that Scotty had had a daughter. Her doctors declared her fit to leave after 4 months, but she chose to stay on for further treatment. She was a voluntary patient and never restrained or locked in, but on the night of the 10th of March 1948, a nurse decided to lock her and 9 other women in their rooms on the top floor for reasons that are not clear. A fire broke out in the hospital kitchen and spread rapidly. Zelda and the 9 other women died in their rooms, in a blaze which was so intense her identity had to be confirmed through her dental records and a charred slipper. She was 47. A friend who had visited the day before and been to a hospital dance with her said they had a wonderful time. Her mind was as clear as a bell. She was attractive, gracious and charming. There was no bitterness and she seemed at peace with herself. She was buried next to Scott in Rockville, Maryland, but in the 1970s their remains were moved to the family plot at St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery. Their tombstone bears the final sentence of The Great Gatsby. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Unbelievably, her sister cleaned out her studio soon after her death and held a yard sale of her paintings. Those that were not sold, they burned. This is one of the few that survived. Her daughter Scotty, despite all the moving about, said that she was very well taken care of and never neglected, and rather than having a difficult childhood, it had been a wonderful childhood. She too became a writer, mainly journalism but also some fiction and plays. She had 4 children, but tragically, one of her sons took his own life. At the time of her death, a reappraisal of Scott's work had already started, but Zelda was all but forgotten, seen only as an irritating distraction to her husband's life work. In 1970, Nancy Milford's biography challenged this, portraying her as an artist whose talents were stifled by her overbearing husband, and this led to a re-evaluation of her writing and artwork. The debate continues about who influenced whom, but it is an unresolvable issue, as their lives, their very identities were so entwined, it is impossible to say where ideas and turns of phrase originated.
I usually end with a discussion about psychiatric diagnoses, but it's hard in Zelda's case.
We know she was diagnosed with schizophrenia by eminent psychiatrists in her lifetime, and some of the descriptions of her mental state support this. But there are also strong elements of an affective disorder both in Zelda's history and in her family, and her last doctor thought she had been consistently misdiagnosed and that her treatments had done as much harm as any underlying mental disorder. I suspect she would be given a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder today, but although this was first described in the 1930s, it didn't really catch on until after her death, and others have suggested, not unreasonably, that she may have had bipolar affective disorder. She was certainly given the full gamut of treatments available in the era before antipsychotic and antidepressant medication: barbiturate sedatives, insulin coma therapy, metrazole convulsive therapy, and electroconvulsive therapy. The only one she was lucky enough to escape was a lobotomy. If we look at her emerging personality in her teens and 20s, there are indications of several possible personality disorders. But despite all the high drama, she did not completely fall apart or cause chaos to others. Not much anyway. So I don't think she would reach the threshold for a modern personality disorder diagnosis. Particularly as a lot of the drama arose from her husband's insecurities and alcoholism. And what of her relationship with Scott? Goodness me, it was complicated. And having now read a lot more about Zelda from her perspective rather than Scott's, it seems clear that his deep-rooted insecurities had a major impact on their lives and stalled Zelda's writing career almost before it started.
At the end of my video on Scott, I concluded that they were intertwined emotionally and creatively, and indivisible as a couple, and still in love to the end.
I have to say, I'm less certain of this now. Even before Scott's death, they lived apart for 3.5 years, and Zelda managed to create a life for herself after he was gone. And in some ways, they did better apart than together.
Zelda's life wasn't easy. Her marriage to Scott wasn't simple. But I hope that by learning more about her life and dispelling some of the myths, we can appreciate her more as a creative artist in her own right, and better understand the backdrop to her husband's writing. Thank you for watching. Please check out my video on Zelda's other half, Scott, if you haven't already seen it. And if you'd like to hear more about the history of metrazole and electroshock therapy, then have a dig around on my channel. I've done a video on this. I'm also preparing a video on insulin coma therapy, which was such a mainstay of Zelda's treatment, and this should be ready soon. Remember to subscribe and hit the notifications bell if you haven't already done so, to be kept up to date with all the latest videos. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon.